On behalf of the Institute for Humane Studies, it's such a pleasure to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a cold Thursday evening in DC when there's 1,000 other events going on. Thanks for coming out for what I think will be a great discussion on Laura Field's new book, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. A couple of quick housekeeping things. Again, the bar and the food will be available for the duration of the event. Also, the restrooms, they're a little bit hard to find. If you go up one level to the 5th floor and take a couple of right-hand turns, you can find the restrooms there. We'll ask the panelists a series of questions. We'll have a little bit of time towards the end for audience Q&A, in which case we'll be circulating around the microphone for your questions. For those of you who don't know much about IHS, IHS for 65 years has supported the achievement of a freer society rooted in human dignity, equal rights, and the lawful limits on power. IHS is America's fastest growing nonpartisan network grounded in the classical liberal tradition. We advance human freedom and flourishing. And we do this by building a network of over 7,000 scholars and leaders who turn liberal ideas into real-world impact in classrooms, policy, and culture. And my name is Matt Kukum, and I'm Director of Coalition Partnerships at IHS. And I have a few colleagues in the room with me tonight who would love to tell you more about IHS if you have questions. So for those of you who haven't read the book, Furious Minds is a deep dive into the intellectual world around the new American right. If you have cracked the book, you'll notice that Laura is not writing about Twitter trolls or about rally speeches. She's writing about the ideas and the institutions and the thinkers that animate the new right. And so what we want to do tonight is to make this world intelligible to those of us who don't follow this world, to think about what all of this means for the political right in general and for American democracy, and also to reflect honestly on where liberalism itself needs to be defended and perhaps also improved and deepened. And to do that, we're joined by three terrific panelists who I will now introduce. First, our author, Laura K. Field. Laura is an associate with the Illiberalism Studies program at George Washington University, a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a visiting scholar in residence at American University. She is author of numerous academic papers, book chapters, and articles, and she holds a PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin. Laura's book, Furious Minds, was published this November by Princeton University Press. Laura's book has been reviewed in the New York Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, and the Unpopulist. It was given a starred review in Publishers Weekly, singled out as an especially important book by Forward magazine, and was named a Best Political Book of the Year by the Financial Times. Laura, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Next we have, well, yeah, clap, please. Absolutely. Next, we have Kevin Vallier. Kevin is professor of philosophy at the University of Toledo's Institute for American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. His work spans political philosophy, ethics, and religion. He's the author of 4 monographs, 5 edited volumes, and over 50 peer-reviewed articles and chapters, and he's still going. His most recent book is All the Kingdoms of the World on Radical Religious Alternatives to Liberalism. Kevin is a longtime friend of IHS, formerly a senior fellow, but still an important part of our academic network. Kevin, thank you for joining us. And lastly, Thomas Merrill. Tom is Associate Professor of Government at American University, where he directs the Lincoln Scholars Certificate Program, which is a core texts program for first and second year students. He is chair of The Civic Life, which is American University's initiative to encourage civic education and engagement. Tom is the author of an award-winning book on David Hume, as well as many other articles and book chapters, and he is editor of the journal American Political Thought. Tom, thank you for joining us. So you might have noticed a theme. Somehow we managed to assemble 4 total PhDs in either philosophy or political theory. to talk about illiberalism in the United States. That's probably really brave on my part, or perhaps really bad risk management. Not really sure which one. I mean, how many PhDs does it take to define liberalism? Well, probably at least 4, and even then you'll get at least 5 answers, probably more. But we're going to avoid that temptation tonight and actually talk about what's going on in the real world, in politics. And so to actually do that, let's just table set and ground all of this. So Laura, why don't you tell us what's your book about? Why did you write it? And who exactly are these furious minds, and why are they angry?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me. I'm so grateful to the IHS, which has been one of the, I think, great institutions through the last decade or so, and one of the few places where you can go and have meetings and conversations with people who genuinely hold very different views, but still share a basic liberal outlook on politics. So I'm really grateful to you. I'm grateful to you, Emily. And I'm very pleased to be here. It's a real thrill for me. So the book is about the period between 2016 and 2024, during the first Trump administration and then through the Biden administration, and it's basically chronicling and detailing the story of the intellectual radicalization of the Republican Party. It's focused pretty squarely on intellectuals, so the kind of minds behind the movement. My argument is partly that Trump sort of provided camouflage for the growth of this movement, because I don't think he's anyone's definition of an intellectual, and I mean, he's a great politician, clearly, and has amazing instincts, but great qualified, but has pretty impressive political instincts. But I think that what was surprising to me watching this period unfold was how this gradually intellectuals across the country from very different factions of American conservatism came together and kind of coalesced into a pretty coherent movement. And it parallels things happening in other countries around the world and sort of a global phenomenon of a liberalism. And so I was watching that as it happened, and writing about it since about 2019, and then, partly, I guess a little bit about my background. I'm trained as a Straussian political theorist. I was born and raised in Western Canada, in Edmonton, Alberta, and I sort of fell in love with the great books through some amazing teachers at the University of Alberta, Leon Craig and Heidi Studer. And I was never very conservative myself, but I was kind of conservative curious through that period. I was radicalized in certain respects. And then I went to graduate school in Texas, and again, was never especially political or especially conservative. But I was surrounded by people who were. And I mean, to give you a sense of how apolitical I was, my dissertation was about Rousseau and Nietzsche's autobiographical rhetoric. So this is not the, the kind of dissertation you write if you are a politically minded person. But I still loved politics, and I loved the great books, but I loved the literary quality of it, and I can tell you more about my dissertation and how it does matter for politics, maybe at another time.
We'll do that over a drink.
Maybe over a drink. Well, not yet, Tom. Anyway, all that is to say, I was never super conservative, not politically active, and during grad school, I sort of became more and more alienated from conservatism, and partly by exposure to these young Straussian men, which we will have more to say about, I'm sure, over the course of the evening. But when Trump won, I was kind of scandalized and surprised, and then I was slightly more surprised to see that Michael Anton of the Claremont Institute had written this famous article, The Flight 93 Election. I didn't know about that till quite a bit later, but then I thought, wow, that's wild. And so I started paying more attention, started writing about it, and then honestly, after January 6th, I assumed that they would kind of take the exit ramp, see that the new right that had been emerging, right, with these different factions I can say more about. I sort of assumed that would be the end of it, because people in the orbit of people like someone like John Eastman, who made these fabulous arguments, I mean fabulous in the sense of fantastical arguments, trying to persuade Vice President Pence to not confirm the election results on January 6th. I assumed that combined with some of the really I think, reckless arguments that were coming out of the Claremont Institute, all of that and just Trump himself, I thought all of that would mean that they would see, oh, this is a terrible thing, Trump is over, and for a few months there it seemed like it would be over. So I was pretty surprised when in 2022 that wasn't the case. Trump was still a live quantity. The MAGA new right, or what I've now called the MAGA new right, was thriving in red states across the country, and they continued to organize. And then, of course, Trump stayed in. Vance, so it continued to culminate. So then I pitched a book about it, wrote the book for the last couple of years, and here we are.
So tell us about these different factions that you alluded to. And it's quite the motley crew. I mean, there's the Straussians, and there's the post-liberals, and there's the national conservatives, and then there's, the folks on the hard right. So could you give us sort of a 30,000-foot sort of like, if 2 sentences for each group, just so people have kind of a mental map. And then perhaps, we can bring in Kevin and Tom and just think about sort of what's holding this coalition together.
Sure. So if you turn to page 37 of the book, I know there is a map, but
there is actually. It's worth
I don't know
opening.
if that's the right page, but I have 4-part division, and it's I start with the Claremonters, the West Coast Straussians, who I have already mentioned, Mike Anton and John Eastman. Charles Kessler is another important figure there, and Larry Arnn, who's the president of Hillsdale College. And these are people who were inspired by the wonderful Lincoln scholar Harry Jaffa, and who was known sort of for his staunch defense of declarationism and equality in the Declaration of Independence. And the Claremont Institute is professedly devoted to the restoration of the America's founding principles. And I argue that partly what's happened there is there's been a bit of a corruption of that goal, a corruption by paleoconservatism, which we could say a little bit more about, and a kind of nativism. But also I think the seeds for this problem were there much earlier, with a kind of rigid understanding of what the American founding principles are, an exclusive version of that Jaffa was susceptible to, and that doesn't really allow for historical change, transformation, such that any deviation from this perfect ideal, Harry Jaffa thought that America was the best possible regime, and in a Straussian vein sort of thought it had reconciled all of these massive tensions in political life. And so from that perspective, any deviation, any shift, any historical, or any difference in understanding about what those principles mean, even from a democratic perspective, became a kind of excuse for now counter-revolutionary action. So that's the Claremont Institute and the Claremonters, and they've taken a really hardcore, militant view, generally speaking, on what's going on now, and so we'll have more to say. Then there's the post-liberals, who are quite different. The Claremont Institute people are very sort of anti-establishment, but anti-administrative state, so they're anti-statist. They're very sort of small government people. The post-liberals, who tend to be Catholic, conservative thinkers, are much more statist in their orientation and sort of support. Adrian Vermeule is this famous legal scholar of the administrative state and defender of the executive power and the administrative state. And generally speaking, what they want to accomplish is a reorientation of the constitutional order towards what they call the common good, which should be understood as very much opposed to liberal freedom, liberal rights, and just liberalism as we understand it. And sort of they want to sort of reorient things towards a Catholic teleology, if you will, Catholic social order. But they want to use the state and sort of commandeer the power of the state to accomplish that. Okay. National conservatives, that's the sort of umbrella organizing group. The principle there is just like hardcore nationalism, which this is Yoram Hazony's book, The Virtue of Nationalism is very important here, but it's sort of the activist big tent organizing group. They've been organizing the different factions together, and Peter Thiel is involved in the funding for this. And Hazony has a very, he's really set out to defend almost ethnic nationalism, as the only way, and as sort of homogenous nation state as the way for individual nation states to flourish. And so he believes in plurality and diversity between nations, but not within them. And so he's even somewhat ironically a defender of Christian nationalism for America, even though he's Jewish, Orthodox Jew. But I think he really believes that you need a relatively homogenous culture. You need a homogenous, you need one language, one religion to dominate in a society in order for that place to flourish and common norms to be possible. But it does veer into a kind of ethnic nationalism, I think, at some points, or is susceptible to that. And the book shows how that organization has radicalized over the course of the last 8 years. Finally, I talk about the hard right. I have a chapter called From Alt-Right to Hard Right, and that's sort of trying to capture the fact that the alt-right never really went away, but it was changed. There was a kind of rotation of characters. And I mean, all this, Nick Fuentes is not in my book because I had to kind of limit myself to people with PhDs or who were otherwise, really important to the intellectual dimension of all of this. But there are a surprising number of people with PhDs who have had an impact on this, from Costanella Mariu to Darren Beatty to, I don't know if Raw Egg Nationalist got a PhD, but and then there's Curtis Yarvin in that section, Stephen Wolfe, Nathan Pekoski. There's this sort of really motley crew of characters who span the other three groups. Some of them are sort of more pagan, Nietzschean, others are more, so there are some Catholics, there's a Calvinist Christian. But they are all recognizable for the violence of their rhetoric, their misogyny, and sometimes their open fascism. So I put them in there too because I found it pretty interesting. And as I said, I wrote my own dissertation on Nietzsche, so I felt compelled to to include them and write about them. And I think they matter. So that's the basic sort of schema of who I'm writing about, and I try to show how these groups are kind of entangled. And I can say more about what I was trying to do with the book, but maybe we can
well, no, this is a really good sort of, it's complicated because there's a lot of moving parts, right? And I think one of the things that's perhaps not fully appreciated, for those of us who don't obsessively pay attention to this movement, is that there are these different factions, and they actually believe some things that are pretty profoundly different and in tension with each other. And so I was wondering, Tom, I'll kick to you and then to Kevin, what's actually holding them together, right? Is it, if we strip away, sort of Trump's sort of personality and his ability to hold together sort of this big coalition, if we strip away, the idea that they can be sort of close or proximate to power, what is it that's actually holding them together? Is it hostility to liberalism and pluralism? Is it, rage over, lost status or societal change? Is it a desire to retrieve a pre-modern, homogenous, hierarchical society? Is it something else? Is it all the above? What's holding them together? And along the way, say something about what are the most important fractures, because that might give us a sense of who might break off and where the coalition is ultimately going to go.
Good. So thank you, Matt. And I want to just start by saying thank you to IHS for holding this event. I'm a grateful beneficiary of IHS and long admired it. And I want to thank Laura for inviting me to do this. I think she's worried I'm going to criticize her, but my job is not that. Let me, to answer your question about what unifies the new right, the way that I read this book, and you guys should all buy the book and read it. I think it is a tremendous achievement. I think that I would single out I see the book as primarily a work of journalism in the highest sense, in the sense that she's documenting something that is happening and providing us with evidence. Laura does have her own interpretation of what's happening and her own take, but I think that the book is going to be valuable even to people who have other takes on this particular evidence. And I would say it's not entirely clear to me what the new right adds up to. So I think there's a lot of room for conversation about that. But I just want to really start by saying, Laura, I really enjoyed the book. I think it's great. I think other people should read it. And I hope that in 5 years, people take a look back and say, what did all this mean? How does this fit together? Even folks on the new right, I hope, read it. Okay. So to the answer to the question about what unifies the new right, the way that I read the evidence here is that the new right is primarily unified by a kind of mood. that the ideas that they use to explain that mood are different and often contradictory to each other, which we'll talk about in a second. But I would describe the mood not so much in the ways that you did, Matt, but as and this is the word that they would use, anti-woke. It's anti the regime that has been prevalent in universities and in major institutions in American society since about 2012 or 2014. But I think it's firmly focused on the combination of meritocratic institutions that use DEI or identity politics in various ways in some combination. And so I really see the new right as that's their enemy. They have all kinds of different interpretations of what that means or where to go from that, but that's the thing that really holds it together. And I'll stop there since we have lots of
Kevin, what would you add to that? Are they mainly united around that which they hate as opposed to their positive vision, or would you characterize their coalition a little bit differently?
Well, let me begin by thanking IHS as always. We've been doing things together over 20 years, but most importantly, to thank Laura for the book, which I was able to read and enjoy and profit from in manuscript. Laura reached out to me on the post-liberalism chapter, but I ended up reading the whole book and learning a great deal because I'd written on post-liberalism, but I hadn't written on the other factions, and so I learned a tremendous amount, and it was really very valuable. The most valuable thing, actually, and this is the point I wanted to lead with, was a large perspective as a woman being adjacent to many people in the movement, because that's a theme. I mean, it comes out. It's very clear in the book, because I think one thing that does unite the new right, and to put it as neutrally as I can, there is a focus on the recovery of masculinity. And if there's anything you can be called by the new right that is the lowest thing to be called, well, I don't know, you said keep it tidy, but y'all know the terms. But it's to be effeminate, right? That's the worst thing, to be weak, to lose, all right? So there's one thing I think there is a sense that something about being a man has been lost. And I'm not necessarily passing judgment on that sense. But it is remarkable how the right has gone from talking about limited government to talking about masculinity in a way that I think is really, really striking. And that the way that you always radicalize is by being more manly than the other person. So the language of masculinity is really important on the new right, for whatever you want to say about it. So that's one thing. It's a sense of a recovery of masculinity. The other is a kind of hostility to the sort of predominant post-war sort of liberal democratic elite. Which includes not just the progressives, but the kind of more free market, classical liberal types, which, of course, for someone like Deneen, they're right liberals and left liberals, right? And so there's a hostility to the institutions of the post-World War II order, right? Things like the UN or NATO, the whole host of, the free trade agreements. So that entire elite class that still governs most of the world, the European Union, they're hostile to the whole thing. So this kind of global post-World War II elite, they're opposed to that. So there's a recovery of masculinity, but there's also this opposition to this liberal elite that I also think unites them. Another one is, and I don't know how to put this exactly, but I don't think there's anyone on the new right that thinks democracy is intrinsically just. So they're not necessarily against democracy, but none of them that I know of think that democracy is a requirement of justice. That something about the necessity for justice of equal power means the sharing of power and everyone having the vote. Even those who are for democracy is very instrumentalist, right? It's very much like it produces the best results, or it's the best way to restrain this or get that. So I think that's another thing that unites them. I mean, there are libertarians that are instrumentalists about democracy that aren't on the new right, but I'm really quite struck by that. That's what accounts for the lack of hostility to fascism. Some of it's fascistic, some of it isn't. But if anything, Pinochet or Franco or Salazar or whatever. So those are the things I would say: a recovery of masculinity, a kind of rejection of democratic equality, and a hostility to the kind of global post-war order.
Laura, would you add anything to that in terms of what is holding the coalition together and where you think the chief fault lines are and what those might suggest about where the coalition could potentially fracture in the future?
Well, I'll just put a couple more definitions on the table because
Yeah.
I think, because of the unifying things here, and so I think you guys covered most of it in a way. But I mean, Michael Anton had this great definition of Trumpism in 2016, which was economic nationalism, secure borders, and America First foreign policy. And I think it's a pretty good little definition for what they think their policy goals are, and what Trump seems to have been up to in many respects. So I think that's just useful as a definition. And I also think they're united by this desire to legislate morality, sort of surprisingly, they think the ends justify the means in many instances, and there's a kind of willingness there. I think Sohrab Boumari said that at one point, that they're defined by not just the willingness to use the state, but this directedness towards the common good, which I don't think is true, but I think that's one thing they would say. And then, I've been reading a little bit about illiberalism as a sort of emerging academic area of interest, as opposed to populism, as like an explanatory concept for what's going on around the world. And it's really good because it ties together some of this stuff, and it talks about majoritarianism and sort of the triumph of the executive power as opposed to old-fashioned checks and balances and constitutionalism and individual rights. Talks about sovereignty as the essential principle of sort of the world order, and a transactional realism in foreign affairs. I think that seems to be very much what's going on with the new right here and around the world. And then just a sort of cultural homogeneity as opposed to pluralism, which ties into the anti-woke stuff, obviously, and a restoration of old-fashioned hierarchies. So I think that's a nice theoretical model that I was like, oh, that does explain this, that I discovered just last month.
So now that we've kind of set the table, there's a lot of different directions that we could go. I guess one of the things that I really appreciated about this book is that, and where it really performs, I think, a public service, is that you want people to take the ideas seriously, even if you think they have profound problems or they lead to profoundly wrong conclusions. It's easy to sort of write off the new right wholesale. And I also appreciate the book because you acknowledge that people on the new right are trying to grapple with some challenging features of liberal modernity around rootlessness and relativism and loneliness and cultural dislocation. And so if you had to name something that the new right gets more correct than not, and then where the new right sort of chiefly errs, what would those things be? Like, what does the new right get right in its diagnosis, even if it comes to the wrong conclusions? And then where do you think the new right sort of mostly misses the boat? I'd like each of you to take a crack at that question. Because I want to use this book as sort of a springboard for a larger conversation about the new right. Kevin, you look like you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah. The thing I would agree with, and maybe there'll be some disagreement here about this, is I think they are right that religion, in many ways, under certain liberal democratic regimes, is pushed too much to the margin of social life. I think what they're wrong about is the problem with many nationalistic views is a loss of a belief in the universal dignity of the person. So the kinds of particularly anti-immigration views that you see, the stunning indifference to the value of, say, having refugees or migrants, or all the false information that's peddled about immigrants, I think is it's quite shocking. So actually, I would say, yeah, on they're more right. I'm not saying one religion should run everything, but at all. But I am saying that I do think they're right that it's been too occluded. But yeah, really missing the implications of the universal human dignity for policy.
Indeed. Tom, thoughts?
So it's a two-part question. What do they get right and what do they get wrong?
Sure.
Just to be brief, I think they're right that United States political institutions, cultural institutions are in deep crisis. I think that I see the new right as something of a symptom. Now they're more than a symptom, they're a problem, but I think they're responding to something that's happening that was, I see the new right as the second act in a play, and the first act was something like cancel culture and the unhappiness within mainstream institutions. I was talking to a former provost of my institution who said the only thing we have in common at our university is complaining about our university. And I think there's a profound, when we joke about that, oh, that's just normal. I think there's something worse than that. I think that we're not clear about what our fundamental identity as a society is. We're not clear at what our institutions are for. And I think the new right, so in that sense, I think the new right is responding to that sense of these institutions are really not doing what they're supposed to be doing. We can talk about that more later. What do they get wrong? Well, I think they get wrong. This is perhaps not the right way to put it. I see them as the inverse of the cancel culture thing. They are saying all the words that you're not supposed to say. And I think here I know that Laura said that she didn't talk about Nick Fuentes, but she does talk about Bronze Age pervert. And I think in a way the whole principle of the Bronze Age pervert persona is to be an obscene clown, right? Or an obscene jester, the person who's saying the things that we can't say in polite society that is somehow puncturing. And if you tell someone not to say something, then presumably they start thinking that. So you could sort of see it as like part of the way that the regime works is that this thing gets developed. What they get wrong is that it's a sense of we have to use power, we have to tell other people. I think that's what happens when people were in the cancel culture heyday, and I remember well being taken to Title IX office. I can tell you all about it. There's a sense of we're trying to control the conversation. We're not actually engaged in conversation. We're telling this is how it's going to be. And I think that that's destructive for democracy.
Thank you. I would say, and I don't want to say I think they got a lot of stuff right, but I have a lot of sympathy with a lot of their arguments. And because overall, I think they're just getting so much wrong. But elite stagnation is maybe the way I would phrase how some of what you guys are describing. And over the course of writing this book, I found it hard not to get extremely disenchanted with the cathedral or the like professional class, and just over the course of my adult life, right? That there's just something about, that's Curtis Yarvin's term for the media and the universities and Hollywood and the Democratic Party, right? I mean, and Sleepy Joe Biden. I mean, to me, that last year of the Biden presidency was really horrifying. I was really mad by the end of it and repulsed by the political class, if we can call it that, here in Washington, D.C., which is a city I love, and I think they're wrong about the deep state and all that. I mean, most civil servants are wonderful people, all of that, but I think that gets to the stuff with the university where I'm less hawkish on the woke stuff than probably either of you. I think that, a lot of that stuff is pretty legitimate, given American history, and I'm a good feminist now, and for good reason, And I think the more you learn, I find when I still read these guys and the way they talk about Black history is just kind of idiotic half the time. And there's a real problem of intellectual insularity on the academic right that I find very frustrating. And so I do think the phrase I like to describe this is coercive conformity and groupthink, because I think those are problems and then have been problems in the university. And there's been, to get just at the thing I actually care about most that I think that they've had an intuition about and they've really exploited is the natural vulnerability of liberalism when it comes to meaning making and to kind of community building and to just human values, right? And to defending the liberal values and liberal pluralism. And so I think that they've seen that the political class has been completely defenseless, completely asleep at the wheel for the last however many years. The universities have done nothing to kind of sustain what you might call Western civilization or the liberal democratic that's not the language I would use, but just like liberal democratic civic virtue, civic life, and the great traditions that we've inherited from around the world. I would want a kind of great books program that included comparative literature. Like there's a lot of room for doing a lot better, and I think our institutions have really failed with a lot of that. So I think they saw, whether it was really an intellectual thing or not, they've clearly perceived that vulnerability in our culture and the deep yearning for meaning. And they've said, we're going to come along and provide some answers. And you get somebody like Jordan Peterson, who's also not in my book, right, but who has this incredible following. He's a total quack, right? I mean, maybe he used to be a little more serious, and I think that he had some probably useful things to say to young men in that first book. But, I mean, what is that? That's crazy. And so they're just riding that wave. Bronze Age Pervert is teaching young men classical music and how to bodybuild, right, and about male beauty. And he's hitting a target. And so that's a vulnerability that I think they've nailed, and that we are very resourceless as liberals. We can't win our own argument or whatever you say, and so that's really difficult. So I think they're winning on those, or they've really tapped into something there. In terms of what they get wrong, well, I don't need to go on.
So, well, maybe zooming out, so we can think about what they might get wrong. What do they get wrong about sort of the liberal project? And I don't want to get into, like I said earlier, definitions of what liberalism is about. But I think there's sort of they're grappling with, how do we make meaning? How do we sort of land on sort of like what it means to be human, what it means to have dignity, what it means to have value, what it means to live in community, and do that in sort of a cultural context in which they feel like there's nothing that's allowing the culture to sort of hang together. They see sort of a decline of religion as being a part of that. At least some of them do, and they see lots of cultural shifts as being part of the story as well. I guess my question then is, what resources does liberalism have? You clearly think liberalism might have some resources to bring to bear in this fraught moment, but what resources would liberalism have? And you talk about this a little bit at the end of your book when you reference the need for a liberal renaissance. What would be involved in achieving a liberal renaissance? And we can circle back to this more later, but how can liberals respond, you think, in a way that is going to be compelling? Because, it seems like, you pointed out, Laura, like they're, as much as your book is about intellectuals, they are tapping into some deep yearnings across the populace, which is why they've had they've gotten some traction. And so how can liberals respond? And I'd like to pose that question to Kevin and Tom as well, and Laura. Whoever wants to go first.
I'll try to be brief this time.
Good.
You're good.
I think the first thing that we need to do is just become articulate about the problem, right? And this sort of problem of liberal culture. And the post-liberals and the new right will say we've been sort of coasting on the vapors of Christianity, and now that we've got all this diversity and moral pluralism, that we're all turning into relativists. They've been saying this for decades and decades, right? The postmodern relativism. And I think that we have to say, well, that is not at all true to, I think, actual lived experience of liberals. We all live in morally embedded universes with our families and communities, but we have to at least acknowledge that there's some truth to this idea that we certainly don't have common moral norms or forms that we're all participating in. And so, and we could probably do better at finding ways to maybe, welcome religion back into public life in some instances. I think the great books have a big role to play. Civic education has a big role to play. And just for liberals to recognize, we do need to learn how to cultivate community and to be explicit about that and more deliberate about that. And especially in our schools and in our institutions. So I think the first thing to say is to just become a little more conversant in the problem. And then they can hire a lot more political theorists in the universities and literature professors and history professors. Historians are the most wonderful people, right? And they need jobs, so that's what I would do.
It turns out there was a self-interest in writing the book. More political theorists getting paid.
Oh no,
hired.
well, we could talk about that later. I'm not sure that's true about that particular. There was a lot of self-interest, but.
So to answer the question, I think liberalism goes wrong when it sees itself as consumerist. I think that the idea that the point of life is going to the mall and shopping, that is spiritually quite close to postmodern relativism. And I think the lack of human meaning and satisfaction that gives is a big driver of a lot of unhappiness for human beings in the world. So that's one thing that I think liberalism should not be. Liberalism clearly needs to have more concern for forms of community, for actually building community, which requires authority, which requires setting rules, and in that way, the integralists are actually kind of onto something. Although I wouldn't want to. I don't think any Trump voter was voting for Adrian Vermeule, is my guess. But the other thing I would say is there is a strand of liberalism that goes back to not the Declaration, which folks love so much, but the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, which I would say a realist liberalism that's about power, that's understands how power works and recognizes the need to limit it and to build institutions. I think that liberalism has gotten lost in a lot of ways, and liberalism is sort of seen as a cultural project of do whatever you want or something like that. I think we need more of that. So.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but it's kind of all I have been thinking about since graduate school. So I'll try. So one
Which
thing
was
is,
just a couple of
I
years
think
ago.
we need to work really. I'm just such a big fan of the doctrine of liberal neutrality. I think it's really, really important because it's a kind of fairness where the state tries not to take sides on matters in which people reasonably disagree. We hold to this as a matter of impartiality when we go into a courtroom. We expect both sides to be taken seriously. It's a presupposition of justice that we try to see things from multiple points of view. And we do that with religion. We expect that everyone gets their religious exemption, right? If some people get exempted from the draft, if they're a Christian, they should get it if they're a Muslim, they should get it if they're secular. We understand it viscerally and at a deep level, and it's a lovely thing and a great achievement. To the extent that it's existed, it deserves to be appreciated. But liberals have to be internally consistent. And so part of my message on this is that liberals have not been good at being truly neutral between secular and religious perspectives. And so, we've made ourselves look like hypocrites because we've mixed secularism and neutrality. And that's opened the door to the new right and criticism of liberalism. The second thing is the study of mass psychology of the decline of our institutions. Understanding the decline in social and institutional trust, understanding the rise in political polarization. One thing that liberals are good at is like nerdy political economy. And trying to rigorously do the social sciences required to understand why our institutions are decaying. And I've spent a tremendous amount of time on that. But part of what we're dealing with is the new right's partly a product of a mass psychology of lower trust and higher polarization. And they only are possible when those twin phenomena are in play. And if we want to, resist that, we have to understand what these trust and polarization phenomena. And the third thing is, the reason I'm, Laura and I are kindred spirits in this way is just like the rigorous acquaintance with their ideas and constant patient criticism. I try to do this with the integralists myself and to, they're sort of kind of post-liberal, although really, it's a complicated story. But yeah, just to not be relentless exactly, but to be systematic and patient with the ideas. It's all too often that liberals can't sort of comprehend illiberalism and so can't really critique it. And that's why, I think, Laura's book's so important is because she made a really serious effort to do it in a very broad way. Just go through the book and just it's very well written. And so you could think that it's just look at the citations. Just look at the references. This is one of the most rigorously researched books in political theory that I have ever seen. You do not associate incredibly well-written stuff with incredibly well-researched stuff. And so if you just read the book, you won't think that. Because I write hard to read, but hopefully well rigorously researched stuff. But you read a tremendous amount of stuff. And carefully. And so I think that you're just a really great model. Yes, you're very critical, but you did a ton of work. And I think that's incredibly powerful when you actually really seriously engage somebody. So those are, it's a lot, but hopefully because it ended in compliment to Laura, it's appropriate.
Can I say one little follow-up?
Yeah, and then we'll move to some audience questions, but go ahead, Laura.
Thank you. That's really, really nice. But I think one of the things that was motivating me is the more I would talk to people about what I was up to during sort of the early days of writing about this stuff, my liberal friends would be like, not even my friends, they get me, right? That I'm kind of weird and like this stuff, but like my acquaintances or people online, you know, I'll say something like, I've been writing about the Trumpy intellectuals or the intellectuals who support Trump, and I just consistently, oh, that's funny, haha, that's actually an oxymoron, there's no such thing. And that's been consistent, it's still just constant. This totally smug, arrogant dismissal of all of it. And I get it, but at a certain point, it's really revealing, right? It's really revealing of a shallowness and of an unseriousness and of a complete failure of imagination on the part of liberals. And so something's got to give on that front.
All right, we'd love to take some questions. So, all right, let's go to the gentleman in the sweater right here. It's kind of hard to see people with the lights.
Sure.
Please state. I'm sorry. Please state your name, your affiliation, and offer a brief question.
Patrick Roberts, private citizen, and are the Trumpian intellectuals or the MAGA intellectuals responsive to politics, or are they influencing politics, or are they taking advantage of opportunities in politics?
Great question.
You want? Yeah.
Well, I would say I would say they started off being responsive and seeing an opportunity, and they've become very influential, the people I'm writing about.
Well, let's press on that a little bit, because I think it's a good question, and this gets to sort of the method that you employ in your book. So the method you employ is what you call ideas first. It's sort of like ideas are sort of a driving force behind sort of social change. And I think the way that you sort of trace the thread of ideas through these different groups is really elegant and very informative. And even if you're not a political theorist, I think anyone can pick up the book and can read it, because it reads like I'm reading a newspaper. So it's really informative because it's so well researched and so well written. However, I do wonder, to what extent are these different factions getting traction because they're not so much driving culture, they are following cultural trends and capitalizing on them and articulating them in a way that certainly pushes them along further. But I guess my question is it really ideas that are driving the ship, or are there sort of deeper sort of social, cultural, and economic and political forces that might be at play? And if there are there any particular ones that you would sort of point out as being particularly important?
So I'll give a kind of an answer to that. So I think that there was discontent that was brewing that was unclear at the end of the Obama administration. But I guess if the question is, are the ideas driving it or is the politics driving it, I think it's important to remember nobody expected Donald Trump to win in 2016. And so there was this kind of tremendous explosion of like, what in the world is happening? And partly reading Laura's book this time through, the sheer number of ideas, it sort of seemed like the realm of possibility for folks on the new right somehow opened up because of the unexpected win of Donald Trump. So now we can imagine perhaps we're going to have a society that's going to be completely Catholic. The Pope is going to be able to jail people, right? That is like that was on no one's bingo card. But in that sense they're responsive. But at this point, I think it's more that they are actually making policy. So what do I know? But the rumor has it that Michael Anton from the Claremont Institute, that Laura talks about in her book, was the author of the very recently released National Security Strategy. That is going to have significant effects, whether for good or for ill, is not for me to say, but is on American politics for a long period of time. So it's both.
Laura, would you add anything about sort of other sort of social political forces?
I did the ideas first thing because that's what I see, and that I'm sympathetic to that. And my own intellectual formation is very like Straussian ideas first, but it was also kind of playful because I think there's something ridiculous about it, and the idea that ideas can just like that these guys are going to actually have the control over politics that they think they will is sort of perverse. But they've shown us how far they can get by seizing on this opportunity, getting Vance in there, doing the Project 2020, like it just goes on and on, the impact they've had. So I think ideas matter a lot, and they've sort of shown how much by acting how they have.
Good. So the answer is yes, essentially. Good. Let's go over to this side to Debbie.
Debbie. Debbie Gate from Steadfast. So I think you've touched on this, but I'd like to hear a little bit more. What is it that the traditional right or the old right did that we can learn from to avoid? What are the lessons? What are the things that the old right, traditional right did that made the new right possible that we should learn from?
Oh,
You guys are both more conservative than me, so you might have a better answer.
I just
Who's to say?
I
Kevin,
mean,
can you play a conservative for now?
well, I mean, I'm probably, I don't know, I'm kind of on the edge wherever of liberal and conservative in a certain way. You know, I'm writing on fusionism actually right now, so I've been thinking about this a lot. And so what did they get wrong? One problem was, you know, communism fell, and so a lot of the rationale for putting the social conservatives and the free marketeers together just kind of fell apart. Like they worked as long as you had the Soviet Union, right? Because like they both had their own reason to hate it, right? And that made it, and also because it's a threat of nuclear war and everything, you've got, you know, a common thing. So libertarians kind of break off from the right in a certain way pretty soon thereafter, particularly under W. And so a lot of that coalition worked at the time that it worked. So it's hard to draw a lesson from that exactly, except to say, like, it's not clear how libertarians and traditional conservatives were going to stay lined up, particularly also once the LGBT movement happened. Like, I just don't know how that was not going to divide. So, I mean, libertarians have always been pro-LGBT, so it was never not going to be a thing. So it's hard to know how to generalize from that. But as far as, you know, kind of looking back, it was an attempt to try to put together these ideas of liberty and virtue under social conditions that I think they didn't realize went away. And if that project's going to revive, it has to be reconceived under new social conditions. But I think that was the thing, is people didn't realize that the conditions of their electoral success and their cultural and intellectual success had changed and didn't adjust.
I mean, I'm pretty sympathetic to the critique of neoliberalism, which maybe I won't go on about here, but I think that sort of Reaganism and then Clinton and the growing inequality and probably free trade. I mean, the new right, at least the post-liberals, have a lot to say about the economy. People like, and there's this sort of way of thinking where they say, you know, in America, the mainstream let economics guide everything, right? And they sort of lost political control of the economy and forgot to think about what's good for people. And sort of with the financial crisis, there's also the wars in the Middle East, right? But with the financial crisis, I think a lot of people became very disillusioned with the bailouts, and that was Obama, obviously, mainly. But I think that's one thing that the whole American establishment needs to at least look at. And some of the new right people have been pretty thoughtful about, you know, reindustrialization or just different ways of thinking about economics.
Yeah, we could spend, like, how much time do you have? We could spend, you know, a couple of hours unpacking the ways in which the new right has drawn very heavily from the progressive left and their economic vision, you know, which one could argue against as being actually illiberal, and in that way, the new right might be reflecting the economic illiberalism of the left. And we could have a whole conversation about that. But yeah, but before we do that, let's take a few more questions, because we could go off on that. So, Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Green from the Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, and I did buy the book recently. I haven't finished it, so apologies if you get to this in the chapters. One of the paradoxes I'm struggling with in terms of this administration are the different conceptions of the role of the state that seem to be playing out day by day. And Laura, you mentioned that these different factions do have different conceptions of the role of the state. It's either, you know, small government, it's dismantling and completely destroying the state apparatus, it's commandeering the state to exact their agenda. So just really curious if you can speak to how the role of the state plays in these different parts of the new right.
I'll speak briefly. I mean, I think that there's a kind of pragmatism that comes into play once they have the power, right? And so with Doge, there are arguments on the new right that can certainly be used in favor of the dismantling of some of those agencies and the shrinking of the administrative state and the transformation of personnel. And then there are other arguments that can be used in favor of seizing whatever's left, using it however you want, reorganizing things in your own direction. So they're pretty pragmatist when it comes down to it. I mean, my best example of this is Patrick Deneen, who is, I assume, a devout Catholic, writing an article for Unheard where he says, there's the Doge MAGA divide is overstated. Everybody can get along, and J.D. Vance will carry the torch both for the tech bro billionaires and for Catholicism. And I think that's perverse, but that's the way it has seemed to go down.
Oh, yeah, from Ken. Right up front. Thank you.
Hi, Ken Masugi. I'm a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute. And while I appreciate your praise of Harry Jaffa, let me read something from your book, which I haven't read yet, but which I certainly will. I find, this is from a forthcoming review of it. This is a quotation from your book. I find Jaffa's later writings unreadable. And then you criticize him for using the term ancient Greek morality for its vagueness. And it certainly is a vague term, and he should be attacked had he used the term. But it turns out he never used the term. You attributed in quotes an idea to him that he rejects himself, as he shows in numerous writings. And yet you display this contempt for his learning while claiming to have studied him. And this goes back to the old Straussian and from Pangl as well, I'm sure, whom I admire as a scholar, but I have very deep objections to on many different grounds. But you have to understand the thinker as he understands himself. This is Strauss's key concern, whether studying Machiavelli or Plato or Winston Churchill, right? And you don't do that. And I don't see any evidence in your presentation tonight, or certainly these extensive quotations from your book, that you do that with Jaffa or these far less serious people on the new right.
Well, I think I was citing an essay by Jaffa in the Claremont Review of Books, but if I made a mistake, I'm totally willing to look at the evidence. And if he doesn't use the phrase ancient Greek morality, then I assumed I was quoting him because I read the article and cited it. But we can look at it together. I do find the late Harry Jaffa unreadable. I think he is conflating all kinds of things when he's talking about. I do recall him talking about ancient Greek morality, I think, in that essay. And I find that absurd. You have ancient, yeah. So, but I could be wrong. I mean, I did read The Crisis of the House. I mean, you read it with you, Tom, right? The Crisis of the House Divided. I do admire Harry Jaffa's earlier work, especially that book. The book's not about Harry Jaffa in particular. I find we can read some other passages from Jaffa that I think are totally unhinged and irresponsible. And I don't think that's really up for controversy when you think of his some of the arguments he got into. But you can read the book, and I'm grateful you came. I would love to sit down with you, and I'm not joking, right? Because and if I made a mistake, I'll write a correction in the next edition. I'm not a bad faith writer about Harry Jaffa. But I do find his late writings unreadable and uninteresting.
To make these generalizations about people, and then what? Okay, so tell us what's
Ken, why don't we take that conversation afterwards, maybe over drinks? So, but let's get another question on the table. So, let's go to the gentleman, we'll go to the gentleman in the jacket right there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Stimson Center. So earlier in your comments, you started off with the Claremont Institute, and you did spend some time talking about Jaffa. I want to know, or I guess what caught my attention was the character you were silent about, so Strauss himself. Do you think Strauss lays the foundation for kind of where the new right goes, or is this something that people develop later on?
And along the way, I'm wondering if you could say maybe a couple of sentences on who Strauss is and what Straussianism is. Inquiring.
What did he really think, Laura? Can you tell us?
Well, there's the text answer and there's the subtext answer. But I would say yeah, just because not everyone here is immersed in political theory for the better. I would say it's good that we're not all deeply immersed in Strauss, as interesting as Strauss is. So maybe say a couple of words along the way about like who Strauss the man was and what is the Straussianism of which you speak. For the rest of us.
Okay, so Leo Strauss was a Jewish emigre from Germany who fled during the interwar period to England and then to the United States, a very learned man who had studied with Heidegger, Gadamer, and other luminaries of Europe. He came to the United States and developed sort of a school of thought that's known primarily for the recovery of esoteric writing, sort of the tradition of which I hold to. I'm sort of a bad Straussian in some respects, but I am persuaded that there are sort of layers of meaning in these ancient books and in modern books, and that philosophers wrote with an extraordinary amount of care, both for pedagogical reasons and for reasons of persecution, and sort of truth-telling, and just for all kinds of reasons. And for art, sort of for artistic reasons also, I think it's important to say. And so so he developed he was a wonderful teacher by all accounts, many famous students, many influential students. He wrote these long commentaries on canonical texts, and some of his most famous students are Harry Jaffa, Alan Bloom, Harvey Mansfield. They all come up in my book. Bill Crystal, Stephen Smith. There are a lot of these men, right, and a few women. So Leo Strauss, where was I going with this? Oh, how responsible is he for the new right? I mean, I try to be careful here because I don't have a personal, I'm sort of a Straussian in my training, but I'm not the kind of Straussian who pores over Strauss or the commentaries on Xenophon on Strauss or whatever the other way around, right? So I'm not that kind of Straussian. I don't, that's just not my thing. And I think Strauss is responsible in some ways for how his legacy has shaped out. I think the esotericism has a kind of secret cabal, clubby feel that is very seductive. You feel like you're part of this completely elite, truth-discovering cult that's actually really positive and valuable and beautiful while you're part of it, but it's very delusional in a lot of ways, and it attracts a certain kind of person. And has become very problematic, I think, for the Straussians. And I don't think he was ignorant of that happening, is my presumption, because I think it was pretty plain from the beginning that was happening, and maybe even intentional. So there's some responsibility there. And I mean, there's a bit in the book where I go on about this at the end of chapter 12, where I do sort of hold him just loosely. He's not responsible for this. I mean, Leo Strauss had his own concerns, his own philosophical worries about modernity. You read Strauss, it's profound. I don't blame Strauss, but history being what it is, some of his mode of thinking and writing had certain effects, and I do blame him for the kind of ways in which he articulated the dichotomies and binaries of history with the ancients versus the moderns. I mean, that invites a very dogmatic way of understanding what ancient ethical thought is, or moral thought. So ancients versus moderns, Athens versus Jerusalem, it becomes a very stagnant, I think it invites a kind of stagnancy, and it invites these critiques of relativism and the sort of the modern world that I think are part of the conservative mainstream that are not true, and a pluralistic sort of multivariable or whatever approach to morality instead of these dichotomies would have been much healthier.
Let's take one more question. Okay, sure.
I'm so sorry. Firstly, I just want to say I really appreciate the parts of the book that I've read so far. So I want to congratulations on your simcha of this book. And I just wanted to ask, I guess this is the most forward-looking aspect. You've been seeing, especially since Tucker Carlson's interview / platforming of Nick Fuentes, there's sort of mea culpa among a lot of the people you mentioned in your book. Yoram Hazony was on Ross Douthat's podcast, potentially saying, like, what is my part in all of this, or trying to skirt around that. Sarab Amari has been on this for a while, also Patrick Deneen. And I guess it's a two-pronged question. Firstly, how do you, to what extent do you believe that they're culpable in the mainstreaming of the undeniable anti-Semite Holocaust denier to such a prominent place among mainstream conservatism, and having this become like a viable path for young conservatives? And to what extent do you think that they are not culpable, I guess?
I think they're pretty culpable. I think it's the least surprising thing in the world, but it's way too little too late. While they've been pretending that anti-Semitism is only a problem on the left, it's been just festering on the right, openly, and they've been welcoming the fringe back in. Not entirely, not at all the conferences, but it's been pretty evident. And meanwhile, they've been completely silent about the misogyny, silent about the racism. Darren Beattie was tweeting this crazy racist garbage during January 6th, and now he's sitting in the White House working with the Foreign Service or whatever. I mean, that's repulsive. And they've been completely silent, obviously, about Islamophobia. And the president is just fueling those flames every day. And this stuff about Somalia. So I mean, it's complete garbage. And I think they're entirely culpable. And I have no patience for that.
So, anything to add before I pose one final question in response to that or any of the other ones? Kevin, you look
just
like you
briefly,
were
one of the issues is this language about masculinity and them always being more masculine than, or you're weak, I'm not, or that leads to taboo destruction. Right, and so you're always more masculine if you are willing to be a little bit more based, right? You violate a few more taboos, and that's, I think, the dynamic. That's why it's unsurprising. As soon as you are, I can be further to the right than you, the no enemies to the right discussion, right? All that dynamic, once there's no enemies to the right, once you can continue to push, that internal dynamic leads in the direction so that it isn't that surprising, I think, at the end.
So is not, this brings a question to my mind. Is that not quite a modern thing? To find the taboo, to find the tradition, to find sort of the norm, and then try to sort of like shatter it, violate it, in order to sort of create a new kind of reality, which you can then sort of like push into the culture and push into law?
So I'm not sure about what you mean by modern. It seems to me that the part of the human soul that wants to transgress has been there from the beginning. And if you read, Greek tragedy, Greek comedy, I think that there's always this kind of like going up to the edge. And I mean, in a way, as I interpret what's happened, that it's somehow like it's the Freudian part of the soul, the id, is somehow, expressing itself. So, and that's partly because we didn't have a very deep sense of that culturally before this. But so I don't see it as particularly modern. I see it as a human thing.
So I want to end on a better note and return to the theme of sort of liberal renaissance, which we talked about briefly earlier, and which, Laura, you wrote about elegantly at the end of your book. So we began our discussion by talking about sort of these furious minds. What they believe and why they're angry. And I think it would be interesting to talk at the very end here about how or what it looks like to respond not with a politics of rage, but with a politics of renewal. So if furious minds are helping to build a politics of resentment and domination, then what sorts of minds must liberals have? And so if liberals want renewal rather than escalation, if we want to respond to fury with something better, what is one habit or assumption that we need to unlearn? And what is a practice or a virtue that we need to recover in order to renew liberalism? And that could be anything. I mean, that could be how we think about power, how we think about the good life, how we treat our opponents, how we form citizens. But at the end of the day, you know, if people are to leave with a couple of ideas in addition to what we learned in the book, what is sort of one thing that we need to embrace and one thing that we need to relinquish in order to achieve a liberal renaissance? And if you want to build on your earlier themes, that's perfectly fine. We'll start with Kevin.
Yeah.
We'll do Kevin, and then we'll do Tom, and then we'll let Laura have the last word. Kevin.
The virtue is that liberals have traditionally been students of social order and trying to understand how social order operates in a kind of systematic way. Through the social sciences, I think the liberal tradition has been strongest in that regard. And that's something we have to continue to do, particularly with all the changes that we're starting to see now. As far as, and so I just think one of the contrasts with the new right is they like to talk, I learned this myself, talking with them about order, so they weren't actually that interested in really carefully thinking through the idea of what, say, a post-liberal order meant. And I think one of the virtues that one could exercise is trying to really understand in a systematic way the sources, cultural, economic, political sources of social order. And then just to repeat what I said earlier with respect to the vice to be avoided is just of trying to avoid as much as possible a kind of secularistic bias of not being able to see the world from faith perspectives and multiple faith perspectives. So I think that's another thing. That's the thing that I think that is to be avoided.
Okay, so I want to say one thing sort of in praise of the new right, which is that it's like you read Laura's book and there are all these ideas that are out there. She says ideas first, and there's a lot of bad things about ideas first, but for the first time, there are people who are saying maybe the separation of church and state is not a good idea. That's, if I can say this, terrible for politics, but it's like great for political theorists, right? Like there's something to talk about. That's what we should do. And so I don't mean to be flip, but it's as though a bunch of ideas. So we read The Clouds in my program, Aristophanes' Clouds, which has the think tank with all these crazy ideas. It's sort of like all the political ideas that were cooped up in a think tank suddenly exploded into actual politics. That's the context. So my answer to your question is, so I'm a big believer in liberal education and core text education. I think that we need to have a way for people to be able to talk to each other across boundaries. Universities have for a long time been on the, if I can say this, the neoliberal postmodern model of everybody gets to choose exactly what they want to do. The only way that we can talk to each other is if we have something in common to talk about, which has to be something like a core curriculum, right? And within that core curriculum, there has to be religious points of view. I think we political theorists have done a poor job of taking those things seriously. We sort of assume that all the serious people were not religious. So I think we have to read texts by, think about people like Thrasymachus, who are moral anarchists, but also read Augustine, read the Confessions, and things like that. And I do want to say one thing that I really admire about both my co-panelists is that they do really engage with ideas that they disagree with in a way that's a real model for what I think that the kind of spirit that we should be having. But I think liberal education, the thing that somehow we do together in trying to figure out what it is to be a human being is the thing that we're missing and that we need. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Laura, last word to you.
All right. I think that the vice that we should try to get rid of is conformity, even though I did my graduate work in Austin, and the motto there is keep Austin weird, and I don't mean that. I mean this idea of like the coercive conformity that I think is a problem, that's the phrase I like for what you guys are describing with wokeness, right, where it's a kind of unthinking devotion to a kind of groupthink that is unthinking and sometimes performative. I think paradoxically, and I think it connects with your idea that we need common texts, but I think it should be very diverse regionally And I would embrace the virtue of contestation, because I think often we expect our politics to be too tame, and we don't embrace sort of democratic contestation and hard arguments. And so, Ken, I hope that you and I can go for coffee, and I mean that, and just a spirit of generosity.
And I think that's a fitting place to end. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank our panelists. And if you have not picked up a copy of the book, you absolutely should. The title, again, this was published by Princeton University Press, is Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. It's available on Amazon and on bookstores near you.
And the movie rights are still available.
And yes, exactly. So thank you all so much again for joining us tonight.